On this episode of What's Going On with Shipping, it's the May 25th, 2022 edition of What the Ship. What is going on in ocean shipping around the world today? I'm your host, Sal Mercogliano. Welcome to this episode of What's Going On with Shipping, the global maritime update for the week of May 25th. So a lot going on as always. We're going to jump right into our stories. But first, if you're new to the channel, take a moment, subscribe to the channel, hit the bell so you'll be alerted about new stories as they come out. All right, let's jump into the mess that is global shipping today. We're going to start our stories off here with an update on global shipping in the macro method. So we're going to look at three stories by our buddy Mike Schuller over at G-Captain, and then one by Lorianne Larocco over at FreightWaves. Mike's first story right here talks about issues on global trade pressure from the World Trade Organization. Russia's war in Ukraine, China's COVID-19 lockdown, darken outlook for global economy. Prospects for the global economy have darkened since the outbreak of the war in Ukraine in February, prompting the WTO to reassess its projections for world trade over the next 2 years, the organization said Monday. However, uncertainty about the course of the conflict in Ukraine leaves many questions unanswered. Jump down here to the heart of this issue. As a result, the WTO has revised its merchandise trade volume growth projections to 3% in 2022, down from its previous forecast of 4.7 and 3.4% in 2023. But the WTO notes that these estimates are less certain than usual due to the fluid nature of the conflict in Ukraine and a lack of hard data on the economic impact from the conflict. Services trades will be affected by the conflict in Ukraine, including the transport sector, which covers container shipping, passenger air travel, the WTO said. So we knew this issue was percolating. We knew that the war in Ukraine, the uptick in COVID-19 lockdowns in China is going to affect the world economy. And we're seeing the impact of inflation in the United States and Europe and around the world. Second story. The New York Fed index shows rising supply chain pressure. The Federal Reserve Bank of New York's Global Supply Chain Pressure Index, a terrible acronym ever, ticked up in April for the first time since its December peak. This index, I'm not even using that acronym, integrates transportation cost data and manufacturing indicators to provide a gauge of global supply chain conditions using variables from the Baltic Dry Index, the Harpex Containership Rate Index, and the U.S. Bureau of Labor Statistics. The index provides a bird's eye view of potential disruptions, as well as regional indicators from analyzing trade, inflation, and globalization trends across the U.S., China, Japan, the Euro area, I guess that's the European Union with Switzerland tossed in, and Norway, South Korea, Taiwan, and the United Kingdom. The New York Fed announced Wednesday that it will start publishing again, I'm not saying that acronym, as a standalone product on a monthly basis with updates on the fourth business day of each month. I am sure we will all be subscribing to that. But if you look at their index, and we talked about this in previous episodes, they talked about the fact that they hit this peak back in the beginning of the year, or December, or the end of the year, excuse me, back in December of 2021, January of 2022, and it's been falling ever since. Well, they were very optimistic. And I said, hang on, just because it's at the highest it's ever been doesn't mean it still can't go higher. And what we're seeing it now is uptick. And that's not surprising based on factors at play here. Third story from Mike, the Mike trilogy here. Container ship transit time, not simply backlog counts, could offer a clearer picture of the shipping crisis. This is a story from Windward and Sea Intelligence. Backlog of ships waiting outside major ports across the world is perhaps the most visible sign of the ongoing global container shipping crisis and issues in the supply chain. But new research suggests that increasing transit times may help provide a clearer image or picture of these issues. And what this means is, go down to the end here, port congestion and global supply issues are complex, require a much closer look than simply counting the number of vessels outside ports. All right, listen. Prior to COVID-19, because of the low volume of trade that was going on and the excess capacity, there was more ships out there with container capacity than there was cargo. Ships were what we called slow steaming. They were taking their time going from ports. That was economical. They weren't burning as much fuel, and there wasn't a rush to get the containers there. What we're seeing now is ports are jammed. LA and Long Beach is a classic one. We're going to look at Lorianne Larocco's story here in a second. But to offset some of the costs involved, they're slow steaming. This is something we saw happen prior to that. This means that about a quarter of all the container capacity that's available out there is being occupied by ships just floating or slow steaming across the oceans. And that's going to have a big factor. Go to this story by Lorianne over at FreightWaves. FreightWaves, part of CNBC's new supply chain heat map. So CNBC is putting together this map, which kind of shows you where the stress is in the supply chain. So this chart here looks at China: Shanghai, Ningbo, Qingdao, Tianjin, Xiamen, Yantian, and Ho Chi Minh City in Vietnam. And what you see here, green is normal, yellow, a moderate congestion, red congestion. Where are we seeing the congestion? In trucks in Shanghai, in container availability in Ningbo and Qingdao, and then also in vessels. And that's leading to issues down the road. And this is interesting. I'm not sure how scientific it is because I don't quite understand what gets a green versus a yellow here, for example. But they're also doing it not just for Asia, but they're doing it for the United States. So, for example, you see Oakland with severe congestion all across the board. You can see it in New York and New Jersey with Anchorage and berthing availability, which is, I'm not sure why it's red there because, yeah, there's ships waiting off the berth, but not a lot. Whereas LA is only moderate compared to what, 100 ships? There's like 28 ships waiting to get into LA and Long Beach. But we're definitely seeing some factors. And what we're trying to do here and what CNBC is trying to do using the data from a myriad of sources, including FreightWaves sonar, is portray the factors that are potentially causing congestion in ports. May last year, I did a video talking about, hey, do your Christmas shopping early because there was going to be such huge congestion at the ports. What we're seeing right now is congestion, not so much at the ports, but availability to get containers out. If you look at the LA dwell factor, for example, it's going back up again. It's not clearing. There was even a report by Lars Jensen at at Vespucci on LinkedIn talking about that LA is talking about enacting their hyper demurrage. I don't know if they'll ever do that. It's been the ongoing joke here that they defer that every week. So I'm not sure what they're going to do about clearing the port, but what we are seeing is increased pressure in the ports. And that's going to lead to problems getting material out of the ports. And we're already seeing it with inflation across the board. All right, let's jump over to our second story. For our second story, let's talk about boxes, containers specifically. This story by Mike Schuller over at G-Captain talks about John McCown's latest report on containers, and in particularly talking about the ocean carriers. Ocean carriers raked in a mind-bending $59.3 billion profit in the first quarter of the year, the highest quarterly earnings in container shipping industry, as the industry continues to benefit from stronger pricing. $59.3 billion. I feel like Doc Brown in Back to the Future. 1.21 gigawatts. This is what we're seeing right now with containers. This is a crazy profit. Crazy profit. Let me be clear again. How much money the 9 biggest container companies are making. Understand, they're making more profit, more profitability than Facebook, from Amazon, from Netflix, from Google. That's the craziness that we're seeing right now in the container industry. This is, by the way, an industry that a decade earlier wasn't barely making any profits, and now they're making record profits. And some of these companies are so crazy that they're privately owned. So I'm going to do a story about MSC here coming up, and that's owned by a family, the Agapante family. Just crazy amount of profits right here. Go into this story just for a second. Q1 2022 actually marked the 6th consecutive quarter of the highest net income ever for the industry. The industry's $59.3 billion net income also marked a 300% improvement on the first quarter of 2021, equivalent to $42.2 billion. Of the 11 largest ocean carriers, CMA CGM led the pack in terms of profits with a net income of $7.5 billion, at least according to McCown's estimate, because the privately held company has yet to release its first quarter results. This is just crazy numbers they're doing. And we have to be careful about this, but understand a lot of people want to invest like crazy now in container ships, but understand this profitability is unusual. If you look at the graph of container ship profits, you got to go back to 2008 to see anything like this. But let's look at what's impacting this. I want to show you a series of stories very quickly and put this into some context. So this one, give me shelter, shipping stocks still rising amid Wall Street storm. So if your portfolio has taken a hit recently, and almost everyone's has, they wouldn't have been hit as hard if you're investing in shipping right now. And Greg Miller does, again, one of his great articles here where he looks at it across the board. He's looking at product tankers. These are the tankers that haul refined fuel, gasoline and diesel. Diesel, the key right now. We'll have a story about fuel here in a minute. Dry bulk. This is wheat and grain because of the Ukraine war. Crude tankers are all over the place because of OPEC and Russia and everything, but we saw them dip and now they're back up again. And then, of course, container shipping stocks all across the board. If you're interested in global shipping as an investment, I always recommend following Greg Miller. I think he does great when he comes up with these stock stories. I love them. The other guy I follow a lot is Jay Mintzmeyer. Did a talk with him earlier this year. Going to try to get him back on sometime soon to give us a talk. Long Beach port chief doesn't see labor deal by July 1 deadline. Talked about the ILWU and their contract renegotiation. This story came out this week. The head of the U.S. second busiest port doesn't see talks over the new labor contracts for 22,000 dock workers at 29 West Coast operations reaching settlement by July 1 deadline, but is optimistic of a solution a month or two later. I have confidence that the two parties know what's at stake here, Port of Long Beach Executive Director Mario Cardero said on Bloomberg Television on Friday. They will resolve these differences within a reasonable time. It's not going to be before July 1, but I think we may be looking at a couple of months thereafter on the front. I'm optimistic. Talks to work out the new labor contract started May 10th. The ILWU and the Pacific Maritime Association, which represents about 70 employers, both say they expect cargo to keep moving until an agreement is reached. So, number one, fantastic. Not going to be a strike or a slowdown. However, we're not going to have an agreement. And as long as there's doubt, that creates uncertainty. Now, Mario Cardero was on the Federal Maritime Commission for a long time, became the executive director at the Port of Long Beach. He knows this really well. When Mario talks, I listen, but this uncertainty about an agreement is going to cause problems. And we've already seen it with cargo shifting to the East Coast. And this is going to create more uncertainty. Go to this story by Kim Wills at FreightWaves. Long Beach sets record, but East Gulf Coast ports gain bigger. Yes, LA grew in April. Long Beach grew in April. LA didn't, Oakland didn't, Seattle, Tacoma didn't, but the East and Gulf Coast ports are gaining. And that's where we're seeing that shift out of LA and Long Beach over to other ports. The reason Long Beach has increased is the completion of the LBCT terminal and new railways that really put Long Beach in a position to challenge LA as the biggest port. Add this story, Panama Canal ship queue reflects shipping bottlenecks. The delays to get through the Panama Canal, particularly through the one lane that can handle the Neo-Panamax vessels, is growing. It was up to almost 2 weeks. It's back down to about a week, but it keeps fluctuating right now. And this is a big choke point. There were 101 vessels waiting their turn to make the 40-mile journey across the Panama Canal Wednesday, 6 more than average so far this year, according to data compiled by Bloomberg. The key here isn't the number of vessels, but the type of vessels. Only the Neo-Panamax can use that one new lane. That one new lane is the big constraint. If you're smaller than that, you can use the 2 other lanes. There's 3 lanes. But if you're of such a size that you can only use the 1 lane, there's your problem. Add this story to it from Lodestar on GCaptain. Carriers blank sailing check rates decline as regulators watch on. The drip erosion of container spot rates on the Trans-Pacific and the Asia-Europe trade lines since the Chinese New Year stopped this week as a raft of ocean carrier blank sailings tighten supply. So if your rates are dropping, what the ocean carriers are going to start doing is canceling shipping services. And what that's going to do is then cause freight rates to go back up. Shipping companies would much rather not sail a vessel and make more money on those that are sailing than sail a batch of vessels and make less money on them. This is pure basic economics. And it's also what's going to cause regulators like the FMC and the Department of Justice to watch these container companies for trying to price fix rates. So these stories, this myriad of stories right here, really reflects the issues going on with container shipping. And again, you got to look at a lot of different factors to get a good picture of what's going on there. All right, let's jump from containers to oil and gas for story number 3. So story number 3, what the hell is happening to fuel prices? I mean, seriously, diesel fuel, $5, $6 a gallon. It's crazy. I'm a volunteer firefighter, been a volunteer firefighter for 20 years. Had to go fill up a fire truck the other day. Holy cow. You want to talk about what's going to kill volunteer fire departments around the country is lack of volunteers and having to fill up a fire truck right now. It's a crazy amount of money. This story by Greg Miller kicks off our run here on the oil sector. Can tanker imports save drivers from spiking summer gasoline prices? Tanker brokerage BRS sees high demand for gasoline imports from Europe. So Greg's story, and I'm going to take a little exception to Greg's story, and I did on Twitter. And it's not against Greg. Greg's a great reporter. He's a fantastic reporter. I love everything that Greg writes. I have a problem with BRS and these tanker brokerages saying a couple of things. Average price of gasoline in the U.S. hit another record high on Monday, $4.59.6 per gallon, with the summer driving season just days away. U.S. driving season is looming large, said a tanker broker, BRS, in a report published Monday. U.S. Atlantic Coast gasoline inventories currently stand at 51 million barrels, the lowest level since 2014, and their lowest level for this time of year since the turn of the millennium. This is worrying since generally inventories build before the start of driving season, before drawing during the summer. The tanker brokerage said that over 500,000 barrels of European-sourced gasoline was loaded in April aboard 60 ships bound for the U.S. Goes on here. Could Jones Act be waived? If gasoline prices reach more extreme highs, BRS said the possibility of a summer Jones Act waiver. The Jones Act requires that gasoline loaded in the U.S. be transported to domestic destinations by U.S.-built, U.S.-owned, also U.S. crude, and U.S.-operated tank vessels. BRS believes capacity limitations of the Jones Act compliant tanker fleet, together with limitations on the Colonial Pipeline connecting the Gulf to the East Coast, could prompt a Jones Act waiver allowing foreign ships to temporarily carry U.S. gasoline. All right, time out. Hold the phone. Bullshit. Calling BS on this right now. Not Greg. BRS, I'm calling this on. They're aptly named. Just take the R out. Let me say why. Number one, the Colonial Pipeline. Now, let me be clear. I know people who work at tanker companies, American tanker companies, which are the biggest are OSG, Overseas Shipping Group, and Crowley Maritime. Let me be clear. Number one, the Colonial Pipeline, just over 50% capacity right now. The Colonial Pipeline has more than enough capacity right now to move gasoline and diesel. You may ask, Sal, well, why? Why are they not moving gasoline and diesel then through the Colonial Pipeline? I mean, if there's capacity, why would you not move it up there and replenish the stores? Easy. BRS and all these other companies want to make money. And the problem with putting gasoline or diesel into the Colonial Pipeline is it takes 18 days to go from Houston, Texas to the end of the pipeline in New Jersey, New York. In that time, prices fluctuate, prices move, and the load of gasoline or diesel you put in there may be worth less when it comes out 18 days later. Better to put it on a tanker, get money up front, and ship it either to New England, New York, or across to Europe. That's what these tanker speculators are doing. Also, Jones Act tankers are available. I know they're available because I look it up. And there are tankers available. And by the way, the most recent market survey of spot rates for tankers have Jones Act tankers just a little bit more expensive than foreign flag tankers. So this is the brokerages playing games. Let's be clear what has caused this. They have been moving gasoline and diesel over to Europe. And because they're getting more money for that, they've been depleting the stores in the New England, New York area, PADD1, according to EIA. This is that area of the country. They are also have a 50% reduction over the past decade of refinery capacity in this area. And all of that translates to low gas and diesel stores in New England and New York. And brokerage firms like this are just playing games right now, because what they're basically saying is we're not going to have enough tankers, and therefore we need a Jones Act. Go to the end of the story here. Tanker demand is measured in ton miles, cargo volume multiplied by distance. The ton mile effect of a Jones Act waiver is unclear, said BRS. Really? The reason they're saying it's unclear is because they don't want that data out there to show it, because it depends on which Latin American voyages are displaced by gasoline going to the highest bidder. It noted that a Houston, New York voyage lasts 7 days, which soaks up more MR tanker capacity than a Houston, Mexico trip, 2 days, but much less than a Houston, Brazil voyage, 15 to 25 days. First off, 7 days? 7 days from Houston to New York? What are you, sailing at 2 knots? That's not what they're talking about at all. I don't know where they're getting that number from. Goes on here. The Energy Information Administration currently predicts U.S. 2022 gasoline consumption of 8.91 million barrels per day. That's up 1% year on year, but still 4% below pre-COVID. So this is a tanker brokerage sitting there saying, woe is me, poor tanker brokerage. The reason for your problem is the Jones Act. But in truth, what they're trying to do is displace American tankers so they can bring foreign tankers in. The cost to load a tanker, an MR tanker that carries 80 to 120,000 barrels of fuel, again, the difference between the US price versus a foreign price is negligible in the price you pay at the pump. But what it caps into is the tanker brokerage's fees. That's why they don't want to pay the extra $100,000 maybe to charter an American ship. And I don't know what it is right now, but whatever the difference is, that's what they're trying to offset. That's the reason for BRS talking to Greg in this story. And then finally, this, why Russian-Ukraine war has not ignited a crude tanker rates yet. All of this, the Ukraine story, the Russian invasion of Ukraine, is causing uncertainty, not just in the grain market, but in the oil and gas market, which we're seeing at the pumps right now. So a lot going in there. I don't mean to pick on Greg at all, because I think Greg is a fantastic reporter. Again, I just have a problem with the brokerage firm sitting there calling. They will call a Jones Act waiver the minute they can. During the Colonial Pipeline, one of the oil companies wanted to get a waiver to haul oil from Houston, Texas to California. Nothing to do with the Colonial Pipeline, but that's what they do. They see an opportunity. Again, those Jones Act tankers, the reason we have the Jones Act is to ensure there are American tankers available so that when those foreign tankers head out and they're not available to us, we have a reservoir of US ships available to haul oil and gas up the coast. And more importantly, in case of war, they can help sustain the US military overseas. That's a vital component that can't be fulfilled by foreign flag and foreign owned tankers that will go to where the safest, most profitable point for them to go is. All right, let's go to our next story. So you may be asking, Sal, why are those foreign tankers so much cheaper than American tankers? Well, this story kind of covers it here right for you. So you have a couple of costs for ships. Obviously, you have the construction cost of a vessel, which in many countries around the world, you can amortize that cost over the length of the ship. Some countries you can't, US, which creates a much more expensive vessel, especially if you build it in the US, because you're paying more money for that vessel and you're paying it up front versus across the length of the time of the vessel, something we need to change. But the other is crew costs. This story right here by Mike Schuller, man, it's the Mike Schuller report here today. ILO adopts new minimum wage for seafarers. A subcommittee of the International Labor Organization, which is a part of the IMO, the International Maritime Organization, has agreed to raise the minimum wage for seafarers to up to $673 per month following the conclusion of negotiations between ship owners and seafarers unions. Under the resolution, the minimum basic wage for able seafarers will increase each year for 3 years, starting in January 2023 until the next meeting in 2025. Under the agreement, the minimum wage will be raised to $6.58, starting January 1, 2023, then to $666. That's a great number to pick. And then to $673 in 2025. Current minimum wage is $648. To put that into perspective, that's about $21 per day that you pay minimum to seafarers. During the negotiations, the International Transport Workers Federation, representing the seafarers, originally asked to increase the minimum wage to $683, up 6.5% or $1.40 per day from the $641 monthly minimum wage that has been placed since 2018. But ship owner unions, represented by the International Chamber of Commerce, rejected the offer and put forward a plan to increase wages by just 3% for 3 years, maxing out at $660. Again, that $1.40 per day, it's come on, people. That's crazy. That's way too much money. I'm sorry. How much did the container companies just make? $59 billion in a quarter. And now they're fighting this issue. Man, now understand, let's be clear. Seafarers come from 5 countries, largely, Philippines, China, Indonesia, India, and Russia. And yeah, $641 going up to $673. In some of those economies, that's good money. It's great. You can live on that. You can sustain on that. However, it's very hard to compete against that if you want to have your own seafarers on it. You can't get an American, a European to work at those wages. It's not economical. It's just not. You can't live on that. Yet a lot of people will talk about the fact that this is what we need to do. We need to basically ensure that our shipping is really in the hands of these foreign companies and crewed by foreign mariners. And understand, one of the biggest issues we've had during the past 2 years, excuse me, is getting mariners changed out on the ships because you couldn't do it. So a lot of mariners were stuck on vessels way past their expiration date of their contract, much like you're seeing with Madeline Walchko and the crew on the President Wilson right now, stuck in Shanghai, which they're still stuck in Shanghai, by the way. This other story goes with it too. This is a story from Splash 24/7, Sam Chambers. MLC updates bring internet access for all. Seafarer groups have won the right to mandatory social connectivity for crews. Yes, crews were on ships without internet access. The MLC, the Maritime Labor Convention of 2006, has done this. The MLC is an international treaty designed to protect seafarers' rights and had been ratified by more than 100 countries who represent over 90% of the world fleet, except the United States. One of its provisions is that the government, ship owners, and seafarer representatives meet periodically to keep convention under review. The idea here is that there were ships out here without internet access, and crews were basically out of touch. Now, understand, even getting them internet access isn't great either, because a lot of them are going to be charged for their internet access. You'll see right here, for most seafarers, the journey home is considerably longer than ship owners currently cover. A Filipino, for example, who lives in Davao, may find themselves dumped at Manila Airport 2,000 kilometers away from home. They then have a subsequent air journey of around 2.5 hours, costing them hundreds of dollars. In that final leg, the employer is no longer covering insurance, medical, or other costs. This is just an example. They don't return them home. They dump them off at ports. And the way we treat seafarers is just crappy. Sorry, that's the word that comes to mind. And the idea they don't have internet access, I'm not talking about watching Netflix. I'm talking about email. I'm talking about being able to converse with their family members. Remember, when the Port of LA and Long Beach sent those ships off to sea away from the port, you severed those crews' relationship with home because they couldn't get internet anymore. That's what you did when you sent them off. That's the crappy way we treat mariners. And it's the 1.8 million mariners who kept the world economy going during the height of COVID. And again, I just think we tend to treat them pretty poorly. All right, let's go to our last story. Story number 5 is the story I find the most interesting. And this story goes back to a story we did back in October on G Captain. This story right here: shipping disruptions seen keeping coffee prices higher for longer. Matter of fact, they were talking about a potential coffee shortage. No, this story is great because of not this story, but this one right here. This is a Bloomberg story talking about this. coffee shipped by sailboats in effort to disrupt the heavy ship's command of the high seas. There's never been a more dreamy way to have your coffee delivered than a sailboat across the Atlantic. A small number of specialty roasters in Europe are now offering beans that have been sailed from South America. While they're a rare luxury compared with standard bags of supermarket coffee, these windblown beans may inspire some imaginative ideas for finding and stamping out carbon emissions from your everyday life. Here's a glimpse of the journey. Roasters buy the beans directly from growers in countries like Colombia before they're stored in a warehouse and loaded onto a sailboat destined for ports like Le Havre, France, or Penzance, England. Yes, Penzance, no pirates here. The crossing typically takes 6 weeks. The beans are then couried to specialty roasters before ending up in espresso served in coffee shops at home. Are they pricey? Yeah. A 1 kilogram bag of Yalo's Coffee La Brise's bean costs $62, but boasts a carbon footprint close to zero. A price comparison, the most expensive coffee beans UK supermarket Tesco sells online is $17. So, I mean, almost 4 times the cost, but moving by sailboat. And it comes from this company right here, Sail Cargo Incorporated. Now, I got to say, this is an interesting idea. If you go to the beginning of the 20th century, there were still sailing vessels moving bulk cargo around the world, largely from ports like Liverpool and New York to Australia, these really long distance voyages. And one of the things you get from a sail vessel is a huge cost efficiency. You're not paying for fuel. Look at fuel costs right now. This is the greenest vessel in the world, sail. And I'm really interested, and I'm really wondering if we will not see the growth of efficient sailing vessels. If this is a technology that really begins to grow, are we going back to an age of sail for certain economies and certain products? If you think about coffee, a very high value, cargo, you get a lot per pound for it. Is that something we'll see happen? I think it's a really interesting issue, the idea that we're going back to sailing vessels. And we do see sails being put on certain vessels. Again, we're talking about new technologies in terms of how we move vessels around the world. So I hope you enjoyed our update on global shipping for What the Ship. If you're new again to the channel, hadn't done so, please subscribe, hit the bell so you'd be alerted about new videos as they come out. Leave a comment, give it a thumbs up, share it across social media. And if you can, head on over to the Patreon page, become a patron of the channel, help support the channel, and allow us to bring videos like this to you. Until our next broadcast, this is Sal, and you saw Peanut here earlier, signing off.